Here we are again to come down to this. You and I standing before one another on a screen. You, my current future to be my past future. It's nice to see you again, or nice to meet you, however the case may be. So, to make things even more obscure, let's read some Heidegger. Okay, just to kind of situate us in the text here. Philosophy, as he starts the chapter with basically, you know, saying that the nature of philosophy, right, doesn't arise until we confront the question of philosophy, which ends up being the question of our very being, right? And that in this questioning, we must essentially let go of ourselves completely, um, and only then will something like being in itself may show and glow in its concealment, right? And that's the important thing I'm getting from this is that especially in modernity, right? Especially in postmodernity, however you want to call our now, our our mechanician and all of our mechanician and our technicity, right? Our our technological way of being. I think Heidegger would say is the end result of a long history of what Heidegger would call kind of a substance metaphysics, right? That in the beginning of philosophy, where the question of being was first asked, right, was like a big bang in some sense, right? And a mystery of how that even started, how the question of what is it that runs through all of everything, yet doesn't itself appear, i.e., being, come to address us, right? That very beginning questioning, where in some sense, coming from that world of prior to the pre-Socratics is kind of a mythopoetic world in which the world was conceived in such a way that held us, right, in some important way. And then when we start to ask the question of being itself, that which runs through everything, right, yet doesn't itself show as one of the beings, when that starts to become questioned, right, it shifts it transforms the questioner, right, in some sense. And you could say that for Heidegger, I think, that original opening, right, in the very dawning of philosophy, which, by the way, if it hadn't happened, there'd be no technology, there would be no science, there'd be nothing that we call like the West, right? It's precisely modernity is no matter what you think of modernity, right? Whether or not you think it's a good idea or a bad idea or something else, right? One thing that we can say is there's something going on in modernity that, to the best of our knowledge, has never happened before, right? A radical, um, different way of comporting the world, right? And that wasn't possible until someone goes, what is that thing? What is that non-thing that seems to give all things? That sense, that radical questioning is the beginning of philosophy. And I think for Heidegger, what he would say is that it's also was the beginning of the forgetfulness of being, right? So once you start to remember being, once you start to see in some sense and ask the question of being, and it starts to disclose itself through your questioning, its revealment, right, is the same possibility for its concealment, right? Only that which on some level can be revealed can be concealed, right? And so in some sense, since the pre-Socratics, right, we has been kind of to really use some religious terminology, a from and a concealment of the forget or of the remembering of being into its concealment. And that Heidegger will show that the epochs of the history of Western metaphysics is the history of the forgetfulness of the original questioning, right? But is given by that questioning, right? That questioning made that possible. So in some sense, you can hear, so in that way, right, we need, if we are going to ask that question again, we need to be ourselves in such a way that can hold open this concealment, that this concealment can, in a certain sense, glow for us, and we can ask the question. And that question ends up being the original question of philosophy, right? That's the origin philosophy, right? So on one level, it's back in the past, but it's also, right, the question that always arrives first, right? It's the origin is in some sense in the future, right, for us, and it's always in the future, and it conceals itself in the future, right? So this is always, you could say it's the horizon of horizons, if you will, and it's constantly like a horizon, both revealing itself and concealing itself, right? So I think Heidegger is saying, as a philosopher, what is the basic disposition that will allow that which is most forgotten and concealed to show itself in some sense? Well, it's and somehow this, and it's interesting because he keeps using this word, somehow within that glowing of what is most concealed bears philosophy and the philosopher's sovereignty, right? Keeps using that word sovereignty, right? And it's a knowledge, the knowledge that's become through this, right, is useless. In other words, it's not technological, it's not calculatable, it's not, it's philosophy isn't just talking about those beings for which are already determined. No, philosophy is, in some sense, abiding in a dimension and seeking to open dimensions such that decide what beings are already in some way. And there's something in all of that that has to do with sovereignty, which is, I think, is going to maybe become clear as we go on. Okay. So let's start reading. Okay, here we are. We are right here. So I'll just read that last sentence of the paragraph that we've already read in the previous video. So it just catches up here. But philosophy has this power only when it risks what is most proper to it, namely to posit in a thoughtful way for the existence of man, the goal of all reflection, and to establish thereby in the history of man a hidden sovereignty. So there's something, so there's something about confronting, addressing, hearing, being as such in its concealment, right? That what it takes to hear that, right, is what our sovereignty is banked on, is banking on. There's this coupling between that and sovereignty. So let's keep our attention on that and see what unfolds. We must therefore say philosophy is immediately useless, though sovereign, knowledge of the essence of things. So I can hear it this way: sovereignty as, in some sense, standing outside of modernity in some way, right? or being sovereign in the face of the mechanician, in the calculation, and everything that we call modernity, right? That that what he's talking about is sovereign in relationship to that. So we don't need to keep forgetting, in other words, right? That we can wiggle free in some sense, and in seeing being, which is forgotten in modernity, in remembering it, right? A sovereignty that demonstrates a sovereignty, and I think it is, in some sense, I would imagine, being itself is the source of that sovereignty, right? Sovereign in respect to modernity, I think. That's what I'm hearing in that. Okay, so on to the next paragraph. The essence of beings, however, is always the most worthy of questioning. Insofar as philosophy, in its incessant questioning, merely struggles to appreciate what is most worthy of questioning and apparently never yields results. It will always and necessarily seem strange to a thinking preoccupied with calculation, use, and ease of learning. The sciences, and indeed not only the natural sciences, must strive increasingly and, it seems, irresistibly for a complete technologizing in order to proceed to the end of their course laid down for them so long ago. At the same time, the sciences appear to possess genuine knowledge. For these reasons, the sharpest possible alienation with regard to philosophy, and at the same time, a presumed convincing proof of the futility of philosophy occurs in and through the sciences. Okay, so I think what I think one of the important historical thing about this is, so Heidegger, I think he wrote this in 1937. And at this time, there's what's prominent, I think, in Germany, and I think it's considered the neo-Kantians at that time, were, I think, vying, and this was in philosophy in general, I guess, is that philosophy was being challenged as the sciences started to really take hold, right? And I think a lot of philosophers were paranoid in some sense that philosophy, like the sciences, would outdo philosophy in some way, or render it null. And so philosophy was trying to establish itself as one of the sciences, but is, as Heidegger's kind of pointing out here, is philosophy is a completely different way of being than the sciences, right? So science, in some sense, grabs hold of entities already known, if you will, already conceptualized and represented, and then does experiments on them, and all the things that science does. But philosophy is that which gives access to the world as such, right? That works out that relation, that makes the world available in the way that it does in the first place. So I think some of what you're probably hearing, right, in Heidegger's essence in situating philosophy, is that philosophy is under threat to seeing itself as a science. So he's underlying that we are not science, right? We're doing something completely prior to science in some sense, foreshadowing science. We make science possible, right? But science can't do philosophy, and philosophy can't do science. Now that being said, I think that there's lots of cases where, especially now in biology, right? And some of the stuff going on in biology is discovering ways that biology is bees, right? That the biologists are forced to, in some sense, having to reconceptualize what is the case. But when they do that, right, and they start to question, right, what is the nature of life as such, right, through their discoveries, they are coming up with results that don't correlate to the metaphysics in which their science was based on. So they're having to actually stop being scientists and come into a philosophical position and start radically questioning, right, what is life, for example. But when science does that, it stops being science per se, and it's doing philosophy, right? Okay. So I'm going to go to the next paragraph. Truth and science, if and only if we believe ourselves to be in possession of the truth, do we have science and its business. Yet, science is the disavowal of all knowledge of truth. To hold that today science meets with hostility is a basic error. Never has science fared better than it does today, and it will fare still better in the future. But no one who knows will envy scientists, the most miserable slaves of modern times. Okay. What does he mean by that? Scientists, the most miserable slaves of modern times. I would imagine what he's pointing to there is that the scientist picks up a technologization of being, right? And carries that forward in all of its experiments. And in that sense is not sovereign, right? But is in some sense dependent on a technologization of being, which is synonymous for Heidegger as a forgetfulness of being itself. Okay, I think that's basically what he's getting at. You can also hear him, I think, science like Heidegger's growing disillusion with the institutions, right, of his day. I think you can kind of hear that in some of his tone. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go to this next section. So we're at a new section. We've gotten this far. We've done it. Okay, 3. Questioning the truth of being as sovereign knowledge. Philosophy is the useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of beings. The sovereignty is based on the goal established by thinking for all reflection. But what goal does our thinking posit? The positing of the goal for all reflection possesses truth only where and when such a goal is sought. When we Germans seek this goal, and as long as we do so, we have also already found it. For our goal is the very seeking itself. Okay, so that's that's in italics. For our goal is the very seeking itself. What else is the seeking but the most constant being in proximity to what conceals itself, out of which each need happens to come to us, and every jubilation fills us with enthusiasm. The very seeking is the goal, and at the same time, what is found. All right. There was a lot going on in that paragraph. Okay, so let's see if we can walk that through line by line. So philosophy is the useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of being. Okay. So in some sense, I think we've established that already, but basically our sovereignty, the sovereignty of philosophy, right, is grounded not in technology, not in looking at beings and an obsession with representing beings with an eye on usefulness, right? And practicality and results and those kinds of things, right? Philosophy is the useless, though sovereign knowledge of the essence of being. So the knowledge, right, when we stand out of that and inquire into being as such, right, is outside of the field of sciences and technology and calculation and all of that, right? It's more primordial. And in that sense, for the philosopher stands in sovereignty in relationship to that. Next sentence. The sovereignty is based on the goal established by thinking for all reflection, right? So this sovereignty, right, is standing on and towards the goal of its reflection. What is that? Well, I think it's what he's talking about is that which is most concealed, that which we maybe call being itself. And he goes on. But what goal does our thinking posit? The positing of the goal for all reflection possesses truth only where and when such a goal is sought. So the very truth, right, that philosophy becomes to and through is the goal, right? And the basis of the philosopher's sovereignty, right, is based on this positing of the goal. He goes on, when we Germans seek this goal, and as long as we do so, we have also already found it. Okay, so in some sense, there's an uncanniness here, right, or an apparent contradiction. So when we posit the goal, right, that preserves the truth of our inquiry, right, and also the sovereignty to undergo that inquiry. Yet, the positing of the goal for all reflection possesses truth only when and where such a goal is sought. When we Germans seek this goal, and as long as we do so, we have already found it. So the very seeking is the finding. In some sense, the point is the process, right? And he goes on. For our goal is the very seeking itself, right? So the goal is to seek what is worthy of seeking, right? And you are underway what is worthy of seeking in the seeking itself. So in some way, the very positing of the goal is simply the seeking itself of the goal. So in some way, you can kind of feel the language of being in a disposition, right? Holding open in your being, right? What can show itself as concealing and becomes questionable, right? That is what he's calling you could say that whole ride, right, is our goal, is the goal in the very seeking itself, right? So in other words, because it shows as concealing or withdrawn, it can't be a being that you can just stand back and ask questions about, right? It's a thing, it's the concealment in which our very being, right, receives its determination, right, yet is concealed. So it can't ever be an object. So to engage in the seeking, right, is the seeking itself, is already in some way, it's both there and withdrawn at the same time. He's kind of getting at that paradox and holding that paradox here. I hear in this. He goes on. What else is the seeking but the most constant being in proximity to what conceals itself, out of which each need happens to come to us, and every jubilation fills us with enthusiasm. So, let me read that again. What else is the seeking but the most constant being in proximity to what conceals itself? Now, remember, I think in this language, he's using things like, it comes to us and every jubilation fills us with enthusiasm. So in other words, it's not an objective. We're not looking at an object, right? We are encountering the being of our very being, right, is at stake here, right? So in that sense, it doesn't stand, we don't just have an objective perspective, but we're encountering ourselves, right? So in that sense, since we're encountering ourselves, we are being, we are of being, right? And we be, but that very being is what's concealed and withdrawing, right? But yet, if we hold the appropriate disposition, we can then notice and ask questions about this concealment, which is the seeking itself. What holds all that is the seeking itself. Its goal is the seeking itself. It's kind of what I'm hearing here. And here's the last sentence. The very seeking is the goal, and at the same time what is found. The very seeking is the goal, and at the same time what is found. Now you can hear that. Finding the seeking, seeking the finding, finding the seeking, right? You got this participatory, it's like a participatory knowing. He's bringing language to this, right? And I think the conversation I just had with John, I think John's criticism of Heidegger here, right, is that he said something, I have to listen to it again, but he said something about he doesn't want just dispositions, right? He wants the virtues, right? And so that's in the back of my mind as I'm reading this, right? And I think there's embedded in this is inherently in fact, this whole thing is about virtue, right? The virtue of the philosopher is that it confronts being. So I'd say some of the virtues I'm hearing that are implicit are two: courage and reverence. Courage and reverence. All this talk about terror, all this talk about giving up everything, all of that evokes courage. It's called the courage. And the appreciating and the constant reminding of being the appropriate size in the face of all of this, right? Especially when what we're looking at is precisely what conceals itself, right? That you could say the I, the one who's questioning, has to be in proper reverence, right? To be in the appropriate level of terror and awe, and conserve them and preserve them. I think that comes about through reverence, right? In fact, he's talking about, I think Heidegger's talking about continual hold at philosophy in reverence. That is and then that's where its sovereignty will reveal itself, right? When you question what is most question worthy, i.e., the being of beings, being itself. Okay. Let's see. Should I go on here to this next paragraph? Well, I'll read it through and then we'll see. Remember, I'm reading this for the first time. Well, not really for the first time, but essentially, you're always reading this for the first time on some level. Obvious misgivings now arise. If seeking is supposed to be the goal, then is not what is established as a goal actually the limitless absence of any goal? Natural question. This is the way calculating reason thinks. If seeking is supposed to be the very goal, then does not restlessness and dissatisfaction become perpetuated? This is the opinion of the feeling that is avid for quick possessions. Yet we remain, yet we maintain that seeking brings into existence the highest constancy and equanimity. Though only when this seeking genuinely seeks, i.e., extends into the furthest reaches of what is most concealed and thereby leaves behind all mere curiosity. And what is more concealed than the ground of what is so uncanny, namely that beings are rather than not. What withdraws from us more than the essence of being, i.e., the essence of that which, in all the fabricated and dispossessed beings holding sway around us and bearing us on, is the closest, but at the same time the most worn out, though constant handling, through constant handling, and therefore the most ungraspable? That says it, doesn't it? He's just, you can hear him just getting more, like digging, like in some sense, getting really at this. He's wrestling philosophy in some sense, and the task of philosophy, right? Free from calculation, from what in his time philosophy is seeking to do, which is establish itself as a science. And he's like, so you can hear him kind of wiggling himself free, wiggling the philosophy free to its primordial essence, right? And it's this sticking, it's this holding fast to this primordial essence, which is its goal is the seeking itself, because its goal, right, is to sought after what is concealing, that shines in its concealment, right? And getting a scent for that, an odor, like to track that, to become sensitive to that, to be in reverence of that, to be terrified of that, to be in awe of that, to conserve this in a fundamental disposition of reverence. That. All right, let's call it a day. Thank you for tuning in. See you in a few days.